During the Gilded Age, not everything was focused on the Northeast and the urban type of environments that we've been talking about. We also have to look at the frontier and what was going on there. Now, the frontier means basically the boundary between settled and unsettled areas of the country. So when we talk about the frontier, we're talking about an area that throughout our country's history has moved further and further west. So we're talking about the western part of the country here, the Great Plains, and even going further west than that, areas that were previously unsettled. Now let's talk about some of the economic opportunities in the West that drove people out there. First of all, we had mining. You know about the gold rush. You know that people went west in search of gold and silver, and there were some other precious metals and minerals as well that were valuable, such as copper, lead, and zinc, and there was a lot of that available in mines in the West. So the possibility of striking it rich and making a profit was an attraction to people who wanted to get involved in mining. Ranching was another economic activity. Ranching basically means raising cattle for meat. And of course, you've all heard of cowboys, and cowboys led the cattle to the railroad lines that would transport them to slaughterhouses. So cowboys were rounding up the cattle, leading them where they needed to go to get on the railroads, or even to the towns where they would be slaughtered in the slaughterhouses, and those are known as cow towns, because that was done further north of where most of the cattle was being raised in places like Oklahoma and Texas. Then you had farming. Wheat, corn, rye, those were the main crops grown. New technology during this period had made farming more efficient. We have barbed wire for fencing. We have steel plows. We have windmills. We have mechanical reapers. All of these are going to make farming easier, more efficient, and make farms more productive and profitable. And here are some cowboys. And I like this photograph because you're seeing actually some African American cowboys. And when we usually think of cowboys, I think most people think of the typical stereotypical white cowboy, but many, many cowboys were African American, many cowboys were Mexican, even very few women thrown in the mix as well. So I just wanted you to have an opportunity to see that the stereotypical cowboy you might be used to wasn't the whole story. The ghost towns aren't called that because they're filled with ghosts, although maybe some of them are. But they're called that because they were towns that were once very thriving, booming places, and eventually they died out for various reasons. So what you had happening in the West was a lot of new towns being settled very quickly near where mines were, where gold or silver was found, for instance. Also where there were trails that brought pioneers out to the West, and also where the railroads were being constructed or passed through. And they grew very, very quickly, and they were very lively and booming. Predominantly there were men living there, but you also had some women come out as well. Some of them were saloon keepers. Some of them were prostitutes as well. These are mainly found throughout the West, predominantly in the Southwest, and many of them are kind of like museums where you can go and visit today and see these ghost towns, a lot of them in places like Arizona and Colorado and places like that. They are ghost towns because eventually everybody left. When the mine was all out of copper or silver or whatever, when the railroad no longer passed through there any longer, these towns pretty much everybody just left. And that's why the buildings would still stand, but there was nobody there anymore, and that's why we call them ghost towns, and you can even go out west and visit some of them. This map actually shows the distribution of ghost towns in the U.S., and so what you see in the red area, you're going to Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, California, those have the most ghost towns. So that's the area we're talking about, the Southwest that I'm referring to. There was a lot of mining activity that went on there in the late 1800s, and a lot of towns that were booming for a while, and then just everybody got up and left one day because the mines weren't producing any longer. So if you are interested in going to see some ghost towns, this is the area of the country that you want to travel to. We've already talked about some of the federal acts that encouraged settlement of the West. We've talked about the Homestead Act, but just to review, that was in 1862. It gave 160 acres of free land to anyone who would improve it and farm it for 5 years, and you had to build a dwelling and live there, and then you could apply for it to be your own land. The Pacific Railroad Act we've talked about, that gave loans and subsidies and land to the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads, and that led to the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad that we've spoken about. Another act we have not talked about is the Morrill Land Grant Act. It was in 1862, and there was a further act passed in 1890. That gave federal land to states and territories to help them finance agriculture and mechanical colleges. So you've heard of colleges today probably that are like Texas A&M. That means agriculture and mechanical, and that goes back to this period of time when these colleges were founded. And the states would get land, they'd be able to sell that land, and that money would finance the colleges. Also, some of the land they were given is where the colleges would be built. Just some pictures to take a look at here. The one on the top left, that is a pioneer family that would be taking their wagon and settling out west, probably taking one of those trails we talked about previously. The one on the right is a house that some of the pioneers found themselves living in, especially on the Great Plains where there weren't a lot of areas that had a lot of trees and a lot of wood to build with. So this is called a soddy because it's built out of sod. Sod is basically dirt. It's ground, and it's grass as well, and those things are made into like bricks basically, and a home is built from that. So that's what some of these people were living in, sometimes temporarily, sometimes for longer than that. And here, of course, is one of the early trains with the steam engine and the black smoke billowing out of it. That was part of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Gilded Age was also a period when there were increasing numbers of battles between the government and Native Americans, particularly on the Great Plains. The Native Americans, just like throughout the rest of our history, were viewed as an obstacle to settlement. There was a series of wars and treaties from the 1850s to the 1890s, particularly with regard to the Sioux Indians, and these treaties took away land, forced Native Americans onto reservations. The Sioux, also known as the Lakota, were the last big tribe to put up a resistance to white settlement. And the Fort Laramie Treaty in 1868 ended a resistance by the Native Americans led by the Chief Red Cloud in Wyoming and the Montana Territory, and that created a Sioux reservation in western South Dakota, and I'll show you this in a moment on the map, what territory was then left under Sioux control. The map at the top left is going to show the whole United States, and the area that you see kind of in a grayish color that is divided up into different regions, those are different tribes within the Sioux Nation, and those are the areas that were under their control. And so you can see a large portion of the country was Sioux land. If you look at the map on the bottom right-hand side, that's going to show the amount of land that they were left with after the Fort Laramie Treaty in 1868. You can see what states it would be contained in: modern-day Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Wyoming. But it definitely was greatly reduced from what you see in the map at the top there. So the Sioux lost a lot of their land in that treaty. And then there is a picture of the Native American Chief Red Cloud on the left here. It said, "They made us many promises, but they kept only one. They promised to take our land, and they did." And of course he's referring to the United States and our federal government. The Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 is one of the most famous in American history, and this is fought again amongst the Sioux on the Great Plains. This began because there was a gold rush. Gold was found on Sioux land in 1874. This kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? It reminds us of when gold was found on Cherokee land in Georgia when Andrew Jackson was president. Anyway, the Dakota were the tribe that was their land, and they fought to keep their land and keep the Americans from taking it over because they were seeking gold there. The American commander of the United States troops, George Custer, underestimated the number of Indians that he would encounter when he launched an attack on one of their encampments on the Little Bighorn River in Montana. And the battle is now known as Custer's Last Stand because he and his men were killed in a very relatively brief battle, but very bloody battle. And unfortunately for Custer, he lost that battle, but the American government eventually wins the war. after this battle, more federal troops are sent to defeat the Sioux tribes, and most Sioux agree to move to reservations after this point. But you will see that there are some that are still going to resist. So this isn't the absolute end of the Indian battles in the West.
Now, the Battle of Wounded Knee takes place in what's now South Dakota, and it's not necessarily as accurately called a battle. Many call it a massacre, and you'll see why in a little bit. What was going on is that many of the Sioux were performing a ritual called the ghost dance, and they performed this ritual as a spiritual exercise to regain peace and prosperity that they had lost. The movement amongst the Native Americans spread very quickly, but it also alarmed the whites out west too. The U.S. military thought it was dangerous. They thought the Native Americans were preparing for war, essentially. So they outlawed the ghost dance, essentially. Now, the Native Americans continued to carry out this dance. Chief Sitting Bull, who was an important spiritual as well as political leader of the Sioux, was arrested, and during his arrest, he was murdered. And this is going to lead to escalated tensions, obviously, between the Native Americans and the white Americans. Now, in late 1890, the U.S. cavalry, that means the mounted soldiers on horseback, rounded up the Sioux. They took them to Wounded Knee, South Dakota, and they ordered them to give up their weapons. One of the Native Americans there resisted. He did not want to give up his rifle, and soldiers fired back. The U.S. troops ended up slaughtering 250 unarmed natives. They left the corpses to freeze because, remember, this is December, it's very cold. And this essentially marks the end of the Indian Wars. This is the real end to any large-scale resistance by the Native Americans. Native American reservations then began to crop up more. They were protected by treaties, and the vast majority of Native Americans after this point will be on reservations. This was a very bloody battle. It was very one-sided, and I will show you a video clip in class that depicts this battle and what happened there. This is an actual photograph from the aftermath of Wounded Knee, and who you're seeing here is a Native American leader by the name of Bigfoot. And you can see that he is frozen in the cold snow of South Dakota here. The bodies were left after the massacre, and not until several days later did people go out to bury the bodies, and people were actually paid according to how many bodies they buried here.
And now some things that exemplify the attitudes and treatment of the Native Americans in America. First, we have Helen Hunt Jackson. She wrote a book called A Century of Dishonor that exposed the government mistreatment of Native Americans and started to open the eyes to some people of how the government throughout the years had mistreated the Native Americans in their desire to take their land and further settle west. Then we have the Dawes Act in 1887. That is legislation that is aiming to Americanize the natives by instilling the desire to own and farm land. We know that certainly the Plains Indians, like the Sioux, were not settled farmers. They were more hunters and gatherers. They hunted the buffalo, and of course they used the buffalo for their food and shelter and even tools. The Dawes Act in that way promoted a destruction of tribal bonds and tried to promote values of white civilization. And this idea is called assimilation. So you kind of see the word similar in there, and that's to make the Native Americans more like your typical white American. And then finally the destruction of the buffalo occurs in the late 1800s, and that is a real significant blow to the life of the different tribes. A lot of it had to do with railroad companies that would hire buffalo hunters to clear the way so that they could build their tracks. Tourists would even go out west to hunt them for fun, and of course this was a destruction of the Native American source of food, clothing, and shelter that they even made their teepees out of. So it was very destructive when the buffalo became almost extinct basically in the West, and then the Native Americans no longer had that food source available to them any longer. So in many ways it kind of forced them and their reservations to begin farming and to act more like white Americans. All right, girls, now stay with me here because this can be a confusing topic to talk about. This is Turner's frontier thesis. Now, it's named because of Frederick Jackson Turner, the historian who came up with this theory or this thesis, and he first talked about it in a paper that he was giving and presenting at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Now, what it is about is a theory of the significance of the frontier in American history. Now, remember that idea of the frontier that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. This is a boundary or line between the settled and unsettled areas of the United States. Now, in 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau announced that a contiguous frontier line no longer existed. The U.S. Census Bureau, every 10 years, takes account of all the people in the United States and where they live, and because they were measuring the amount of people in the country and figuring out where they lived, they realized there was no longer that line where we could say this is where settled America ends and unsettled America begins, basically. That no longer existed, and so many people thought the frontier had kind of ended at that point. Now, what Turner said in this thesis or theory is that the frontier helped to form the American character, and it developed unique characteristics because of this constant frontier that existed. If you look at the country from the beginning, when it was just colonies, there was always that frontier to the west. And as the country moved further and further west, the frontier was pushed further and further west. But there was always, at some point, according to Turner at least, settled America versus unsettled, kind of savage, uncivilized America is what he's saying here. And because of that frontier, it created these unique characteristics. So these were being socially mobile, the ability to move up in social status, being adventurous, self-reliant. You didn't rely on other people, just yourself, self-improving, committed to democracy, and independent. And these were the traits that helped build America, according to Turner. And one of the problems, then, is that when this frontier ends, what's going to happen at that point? And so this was used to justify imperialism and colonialism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so the next thing we're going to be talking about in the next unit is this idea of imperialism. You learned about it in global studies, and we'll be learning it from an American perspective and looking at areas of the world that America basically conquered and took over as part of this imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And that became, and those areas became this new frontier to us. So, as with any theories, there are problems with that theory. And eventually, over time, a lot of people started to see more problems with Jackson's theory. And for a long, long time, this was a prevailing theory about the development of our country and our westward expansion. However, most historians today have kind of just discounted it. Maybe they believe certain portions of the theory to be true to a certain extent, but here are some of the problems. First of all, it disregarded contributions of women and other ethnic groups to the development of our country from east to west throughout our history. And we certainly know that freedom and opportunity were not as easily available to those groups as they were to your typical WASP, your typical white male who was settling the country. It also emphasized individual effort, this ruggedness, this individuality, this self-reliance, but it didn't really acknowledge that the federal government had done a lot to encourage the settlement of the West, including the Homestead Act, including the subsidies in railroads and certain investments in businesses in settling the West. So it didn't really talk about those things. And it really disregarded the Native American civilization as savages, even though, they had some very sophisticated social structure. Turner's theory doesn't really take that into account. So it is a theory that we should know of, but there are certainly some problems with the theory when we look at it from the point of view of, people in 2014.